According to the National Center for Education Statistics, Department of Education, in 2018 and 2019, the number of students ages 3 to 21 who received special education services through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was 7.1 million, or 14% of the public school population. When it comes to their physical education, the question remains, how effective are those services for this segment of our student population? To examine this question in further detail, I turn to Dr. Scott McNamara, an assistant professor at the University of Northern Iowa, who teaches physical education and adaptive physical education courses. Dr. McNamara is originally from Detroit and has experience as a special educator and an adaptive physical educator as well. In addition, Dr. McNamara has also developed the What's New in APE podcast, which examines his field with in-depth interviews with industry professionals and panel experts. He joined me this week to have a revealing and consequential conversation on this essentially important topic. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. No problem. But Professor, if you're ready, I'll welcome you to the program. And I'm excited to talk to you about adaptive physical education this morning. Great to be with you this morning, and thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, I wanted to begin our discussion this morning just to get your overall view on the state of adaptive physical education in America and where you think that stands.
Well, that is a big question. So adapted physical education it was kind of born within the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1975. And that's where the service or label of adapted physical education kind of originates, right? So it's been around for about 45 years in some capacity, right? And maybe there was something that looked similar to it before that as well, but that's where a lot of us see kind of our origin story. So with that, it really depends state to state, district to district, on how strong adapted physical education services are. I'm a big advocate of getting people with disabilities and all people access to recreation, physical activity, and promotion of health. And I think that's, in the literature at least, it's pretty evident that that's not always the case. So this is an avenue to try to kind of build those areas up. But when you ask, like, what's the status of this nationwide, it really depends. What I have seen in my experiences, there's pockets of really quality programming out there. La Crosse, Wisconsin has some. There's some areas in Michigan. When I lived in Dallas, Texas, there was a lot of that. There's a lot of areas in California, Minnesota, Maryland. So there's kind of these pockets, and even though I'm saying states, they're not always the entire state either, of really high quality programming. But what I see, my stance on the assessment of it is that there's a lot of districts that don't follow the law. They kind of either don't know about the services or they kind of ignore them. And so I would say there's a lot of haves and have-nots, and a lot more have-nots in the field of adapted physical education. So, I guess that's generally how I see it, is that it's an area that it's in my opinion, I believe it's a very, very important service within the special education realm, right? Of trying, and I think physical education is a really important piece of education that I think is not talked about a lot. And it's partially because physical education teachers are not always the best, have not always represented the field that well. But to me, education should not just be about math and reading, but it should be about developing the body, learning about movement, and learning about my overall thing is I think it's an important area that I think's been overall neglected in student with disabilities educational programming. And I think there's a lot of avenues to talk about it, because I think it's not just, I think that physical education by itself, regardless of ability, is something that's not always taught to the most meaningful way. And it's something that is also neglected or not seen as having a high importance in a lot of the key stakeholders in the education world.
Absolutely. And Professor, having cerebral palsy myself, I know the value of physical movement and physical education. And certainly when we look at educational budgets, certainly when budget cuts have to be made, oftentimes physical education is one of the first things that is looked to be trimmed when we look at the support staff that's provided to people with disabilities in schools. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the impact of budget cuts as it relates to the quality of physical education that we can provide students.
Well, I think the literatures in my experiences are that, they are often very limited. What you said is true. They're the first to kind of be cut, or the first not to be considered. If there are, it's a rough world. And then, sometimes then you have equipment that's 30, 40 years old, or personnel staff that's not going there. One thing I'll mention is that as it relates to people with disabilities, the literature I think is really strong in the last few years of trying to talk to people with disabilities about their experiences in physical education. And what we hear, and not all groups of people with disabilities are represented in that literature, mainly people with physical disabilities or visual impairments is a really prominent one. But we see that they often have really negative experiences in physical education for a variety of reasons. Um, Maybe the teacher is not that well trained in working with kids with disabilities, or has, maybe a certain mindset. We get the story of the scorekeeper, where the kid's more of a scorekeeper rather than participating in physical education in a meaningful way. We also get, that sometimes kids with disabilities um, feel like their disabilities put on display in a very unique way because their body's put on display in front of their peers. And so we've heard all these kind of things that I would say have been negative, and then maybe even some people's experiences are scarring. Now, I don't have a disability, so I can't speak to that myself, but when I hear these things, and I hear about how terrible experiences that many children with disabilities have in this specific setting, and then I also hear that resources are being taken away. I don't think I think that's going to, versus us trying to mediate and help this problem and try to give a better quality program for physical education, which then promotes exercise, physical activity, and just, health and well-being. for people with disabilities. But like when we're taking resources away, we're basically making we're going to exacerbate, or we're going to make the problem worse. Um, and that's those are the things that I'm focused on, the things that I'm fearful of when we're talking about cutting, is that you know we're talking about often making the programming even worse than it already is, versus trying to help make it better.
And I know that one of the ways that you are trying to deliver or elevate that message is through your podcast, What's New in APE. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about the podcast. And I know that you talk to industry experts about this very problem.
Yeah, no, I've had the podcast now for about 5.5 years, which seems really crazy, and makes me feel like I started it all young and excited, and I love podcasting. I'm doing research on using podcasts to kind of disseminate knowledge and to improve attitudes. Yeah, I've been doing it, and I went into it really naively. I don't know what your story is about starting the podcast, but I was going through iTunes years ago now, and I was listening to like Jalen and Jacoby, which is a basketball one, and stuff like that. And then I looked up my field of adapted physical activity, and I saw nothing. And I thought, let me try this. And I did. And it started off slow, and then it's gained some momentum. People seem to actually listen to it, or a few people do. And I interview all types of people. Actually interviewed a Canadian this morning in Alberta, who did some research about the ethics of our field. And I talked to researchers, authors, maybe nonprofit executives, teachers, all types of people that are, related in some way to our field. And we talk about who we are, what we are, why we are. And because I find that connection is important, I also think that oftentimes physical educators, adaptive physical educators, are kind of marginalized in their own school districts. They might be the only one. They might not feel that other people value what they do. And I find that I've gotten a lot of response from people in those positions that say it was so nice to hear somebody else going through the same experience as me. So yeah, that's been my one of the things that I've been really interested in.
Yeah, Professor, and since you brought it up, I'll let you know. This podcast actually started because I was about to start a job that I had previously. I was the ambassador for something called the Discoverability Network here in Windsor on behalf of people with disabilities. It was when I worked on the network, I called it the eHarmony of dating because it was a website where you go on the website and you create a profile and you're matched with employers who want to hire people with disabilities. And obviously, if you're a job seeker, it works the opposite way. And during the time I was a part of the network, I was able to get a total of 70 people employed with a disability they either got a job or an internship. And I was about to start that job again, and then COVID hit because my job was to get employers and job seekers to sign up for the network. And then COVID hit, and then my contract got suspended, so I had some extra time, so I started this podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. Everyone's story about making their podcast is always, I find, something to be unique. But yeah, to me, I think that one of the big barriers in my field is, yeah, the amount of knowledge, quality knowledge out there. And so that's one of the things that I'm always trying to get, and different perspectives. That's to me, because like I could talk to you just about the power of podcasting, because I think that podcasts are a really powerful tool to hear unique voices, unique experiences, and they tell them in a way that is not just a straight lecture versus it's conversation. And conversation in itself is enticing.
Yeah, and I know that you studied podcasting at Texas Women's University, and I'm curious, what lessons more specifically did you learn about podcasting and how it can help in this regard?
Sure. So I've done these two types of podcast studies so far. One in the one I did in my dissertation at Texas Women's University, I did it with these podcasts where they basically they're these very short and concentrated podcasts that are like 10 minutes a piece. And I've given them to a few different people now to see knowledge change and self-efficacy, which is confidence change and such, and they definitely do, especially with knowledge change. They give quick information. I look at those as like kind of those when you go onto YouTube and you look up like a how to whatever, like put in a toilet or whatever, like I look at those video podcasts as a very quick like how to videos. And they have shown to have good knowledge change, especially, and some self-efficacy change too. But I've also then started looking at my own podcast, which I think resembles more of what you're doing, which are these open-ended, long-form interviews. And I have done focus groups and post interviews with people, most my undergraduate students, who have listened to them and asked them about their effectiveness, how they change their attitudes and knowledge towards something. And what I have found is I believe that these types of podcasts, when they're structured in a certain way, when you're talking to certain guest and they're centered around a topic, can actually lead to a really profound, deeper learning that I think is difficult to replicate in most other settings. So I think makes podcasting, this long form type, really unique. I think that conversations um, allow for this really unique kind of interest level and authenticity, which is also a big word when you start looking at podcasting literature. Is that we believe that podcasting is a unique form of media in because it allows us to get an in-depth understanding um, and connection to those that are on the podcast. So, for example, like when I watched 2020 with Barbara Walters, she does a this is an interview, right? She's a journalist. I don't feel like I know Barbara Walters at all. But if I listen to two or three of your podcasts, Kevin, and you're giving me stuff about who you are, I might feel that I know you. And now that I've done this for a few years, I have had not all the time at all, but I've had a few occurrences now where people come up to me at conferences and they feel like they know me and I have never met them in my life. And it's because they're listening to the podcast and because there's this personal relationship that's occurring. So there's a lot of stuff I think with these long form podcasts that they can be used in this really unique way to inform knowledge and like change attitudes and perspectives in a unique way that I think even in a traditional face-to-face setting um, is sometimes difficult to replicate. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wanted to also ask you about the changes in physical education, Professor. And I'm particularly interested, 'cause I know for me, with my cerebral palsy, something like swimming classes and just spending 45 minutes in a pool really helps me. So I'm wondering if you can comment on how adaptive physical education has changed for the better.
how has it changed for the better? Well, I think that I think that there is a lot of research out there. I think there's a lot of you know, teachers and such that are being informed. Swimming is one of the best kind of uh, interventions or practices that has been researched. So, I think utilizing those types of things, absolutely. I think that we've also have started to look at functionality of movement versus saying that this is the proper way to throw something. If I look at somebody with maybe cerebral palsy and I say, like this is what their body, this maybe isn't proper form for them. So what's the functionality? What's the best way I can do this? Looking at how the way your body moves, right? I think there's a lot of improvements in those ways. I think in addition, we've done a lot with social emotional learning. So trying to build up that entire idea of wellness, and not just, and so we want to, hit on all these pieces of being healthy. It's not just physical. But obviously we do want to get you those tools. Other things are getting students out into the community, actually taking them to a YMCA or a fitness center and showing them, and also showing the staff members how to work with people with disabilities. Um, I've also seen big things kind of in the wider world of adapted physical activity, which is kind of just physical activity in general for people with disabilities. I've seen a lot with disability sport kind of clubs out there. I've seen a lot of like grassroots movements, where they're creating disability sport clubs or recreation, therapeutic recreation kind of activities, or even fitness centers that are specially designed for people with disabilities. I think that there's at times, sometimes physical educators that are collaborating with these groups that are kind of driving those forces. But to me, those are the areas that I have seen some of the biggest improvements, I would say, is really strong grassroots movements, where we're trying to get disability sports, access to disability sports. One other one that I'm really passionate about is, especially like in middle school, high school, I'm really big, and I've seen this a little bit more, of teaching disability sports within high school, middle school classes, regardless of whether there's children with disabilities or certain types of disabilities in those classes. And to me, we teach it either as its own kind of unit, and we teach it as a Paralympic unit. The Paralympics has done a tremendous job overall of improving attitudes and awareness and knowledge towards the importance of sport and health in people with disabilities. So you either teach it as a full unit and you go through a variety of kind of disability sports that encapsulate and demonstrate the culture that comes with sport and disability. Or you can do like a volleyball unit, and within volleyball, you do a day or two of sitting volleyball, and just always kind of show it as, here is another form of, or a closely related sport, such as city volleyball. So those things have been big improvements in my eyes.
And Doctor, I'm also curious to get your thoughts on the impact of increased physical education as it relates to the overall emotional and mental development of people with disabilities. I know that for myself, I live my life through a model that I've sort of coined as inclusion is the gateway to independence. And I uh, especially think this is true for students with physical disabilities and the value of human connection when it comes to adaptive physical education. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think you got two big concepts there, and the one is about social emotional learning. I worked at a day center, which is like basically a school for kids that have severe emotional disturbance, quote unquote, where and I saw physical education be this tremendous benefit for them. Every day we did these things called cooperative learning activities, which are basically working on things like trust and team, leadership, communication. And working through those things, I saw these to be a tremendous benefit and really hitting a curriculum that was meaningful. Again, I think that this stuff can be meaningful for all students. And it's something that I wish that education in general would emphasize more, because I think that we need to be good citizens and be happy. And those things come from understanding how to listen, how to trust, how to communicate, how to be a leader and a follower, and those cooperative learning things that I think can really hit those. Obviously, exercise goes into that too, of trying to regulate, you know, our hormone levels and making us, you know, just endorphins and dopamine and all those positive things that we also want to hit in there. You then hit on that idea, I think you said, of inclusion leads to independence. And, you know, I definitely have a strong take on what is inclusion. And in my eyes, inclusion is what your experience is, and feeling a sense of belonging and acceptance within a group. So I think when you say, you know, inclusion is the gateway to independence, I would completely agree with you. But I think that when we say inclusion, I think it's important that when we talk about inclusion, it's not just merely I'm sitting in a room with people with disabilities and people that are able-bodied, rather that the people with disabilities feel like they're and people that are able-bodied feel like they're part of the same group, and feel connected to each other, feel accepted with and you know, and safe, and feel like they belong in the same, you know, or feel like they are part of this larger group. I think that that needs to happen versus just us saying that, you know, we do this a lot. Physical education has also been called a dumping ground for people with disabilities, where it's maybe the only class in special, you know, in the K-12 thing, it's the only class that they're put into where they're with their general ed peers. However, maybe they have the teachers have no training, it's a larger setting, it's a lot noisier, and it ends up being a negative experience. To say that that's inclusion, I'm not sure is correct. Rather, inclusion's occurring when it's, I think, a positive experience where we have this sense of belonging and acceptance within the larger group. But that's just my perception, on what inclusion is. And I think that type of inclusion can lead to independence and all these greater outcomes.
Absolutely. And Professor, talking to you, I'm curious to get your thoughts on why you're so passionate about this work and the work that you do, and any message that you would have for physical education teachers and teachers in general about how they can better incorporate students with disabilities.
Yeah. I'll hit the first one on, or the second part about how teachers can be maybe better include students with disabilities. And I think my big thing that I'm getting on right now is listening to their students, asking their students, talking to their students in whatever way that they communicate, and trying to see what it is that, you know, what do they want their curriculum driven? How, like, what are the things, what are the physical education components that they're most interested in? What are they most likely to do outside in their community? But also to understand, like, how are they feeling about their experience? I think that we need to give autonomy to our students and give them voice. I think that when we're talking about students with disabilities and just K-12 students in general, we're very teacher driven overall, and that we need to be a little bit more student driven. Why I'm interested in adapted physical education, you know, I have a long drawn out origin story, but overall, you know, I think what initially drove me is I have a younger brother who's 10 years younger than me, who has you know, a milder disability. But I watched my mom um, go through kind of the struggle of being a parent of a special education that had to navigate the special education process. Not that I think the struggle of having a child with a disability is too difficult, but I think the process of having to go through the special education process was very difficult on my mother, of these trained professionals often telling her how, what my brother's aptitude or what type of jobs he was going to get when he was in 6th grade, 5th grade. He's doing very well now, and she was told several times that he was not going to be able to have a job. Um, and those so those are things that drove me to kind of get into the field of advocacy. And I started working with kids in a soccer program when I was early on in my college experience. And I had this wonderful person. I actually got my bachelor's in special ed, and then in my master's, I met this great person at Wayne State University, which I'm sure you're well aware of, being in Windsor. And that hooked me into adaptive physical education. And and I really have become very passionate about the curriculum and what it can offer kids with disabilities uh, uniquely to other areas. And I believe it's a civil rights issue that people with disabilities should be able to access quality physical activity, quality physical education. Health and wellness should be a civil rights thing, and it should be something that all people have access to. And as you see me on my soapbox right now, these are the things that kind of drove me to get passionate about it.
Yeah, Professor, I can see that we have a similar synergies of interest. And I'll tell you a quick story. I actually am an identical twin brother. So I have an identical twin brother, and we were both born with cerebral palsy. My brother Keith is actually studying for his PhD currently at Wayne State in sports and exercise psychology. So I'm familiar with Wayne State, and my brother actually grew out of his CP. It affects things like his handwriting still, but I think that any way we can open up doors of inclusion when it comes to physical education and my background in inclusive employment, it's always a good thing. So I want to commend you for the good work that you're doing.
I appreciate it, Kevin, and that is interesting that you got a brother there. Yeah, that's great. And it's always interesting to meet twin brothers too. I'm sure that you all have a lot of unique things just from being twin brothers. I have very good friends that are twin brothers, and they're always coming up with crazy stories about their childhood. So
Twin telepathy, that's exactly
yes,
right.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So, Professor, I know that you're originally from Detroit, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you miss most about this region. As you know, I live in Windsor and Essex County, which is right across the river from Detroit, and
Yeah.
my dad's originally from Detroit, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you miss most about this region.
Oh man. All right. You hit me on on the things that I'm very so I've been gone for like 7 years. 8, 7, 8 years, which seems really long. I love the city of Detroit. I'm an East Sider. I grew up in St. Clair Shores and East Point, like 8 Mile and Gratiot area. And then also I lived in Midtown, I lived in North End. So those are kind of, if you're familiar with the areas, those are so I'm but I love, man, I miss a lot about Detroit. I had a big, thriving and large community of people that were in the art scenes and all. So I miss a lot of that stuff, and I miss the music. I miss the jazz fest. I miss I miss kind of just seeing the things that I would see every day. I used to live right next to the Motown Museum and Fisher Building, and taking a jog and seeing those things on a daily basis. But yeah, I miss the culture that was there too. I was fully infatuated with the city of Detroit, and I miss quite a bit about it. And I miss the bars, and I miss the restaurants, and I miss and there's definitely specifics that I miss. And there's just Cass Cafe. I don't know how much you're familiar with all the Detroit kind of icons, or Lafayette, Coney Islands, and all those things. And I miss all that stuff. I got married on Belle Isle, so I am a pretty and I can actually trace my family back to Detroit from like the 1850s. So I'm a hardcore Detroiter, and so it's hard for me. All of my family's in the area still, or most 90% of them. And so it's hard for me to not be in my city of that I love. So
Yeah, Professor, the Midtown and downtown area has certainly changed a lot. And one thing about the new Detroit downtown is that all four major sports arenas are within a quarter mile of each other. So that's kind of cool.
yeah, I don't know if you can see it. It's in my corner. There's a Rip Hamilton over there. There's a Rip Hamilton bobblehead. So yes, no, I because right when I was moving, they actually tore down my favorite bar called the Comet Bar to put up the Little Caesars Arena, right? So I had mixed feelings about it because I was like literally it was in the Cass Corridor area, which is now basically not even a thing because there's all the stadiums. But yeah, so the stadiums came in and it basically was coming up when I was leaving, so I didn't get to enjoy it because I'm a basketball fanatic. But yeah, every time I come home, I always go to a Pistons game, even though usually it doesn't end well. And but yeah, so those are yes, I loved and at Wayne State, I had my graduation ceremony on Ford Field, which was really cool. So I've been to so many hockey games and Tiger games and Lions games growing up. I have very fond memories of all those things.
Well, I'll tell you, the rallying cry around these parts this day is for all four Detroit major sports students, Professor, is embrace the rebuild. So you turn on the radio, that's all you hear. But I'll tell you, 2004 was the last time the Pistons were actually relevant. But yeah, they're going through a painful but necessary rebuild, I think, Professor. So, being a Detroit sports fan myself, I can relate to your trials and tribulations, Professor, for sure.
Okay, are you a Pistons fan?
If I had to root for a basketball team, I would root for Detroit. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I think very positive about their rookies right now. I'm very positive, very high on them. So we'll
Well,
see.
there's nowhere to go but up, Professor. Right? So.
Yes, yes.
And my final question for you, Professor, is I'm wondering if you've given any thought to your overall legacy and how you want your work in the field of adaptive physical education to be defined.
Oh man, that's a tough question, man.
That's why I
I'm only
left it for the last one.
that's only my I'm only in my third year as an assistant professor, so I should state that. So I'm new in the field, at least in people that have been working 40 years as an assistant professor. I'm not sure I can accurately, address that. I think I'm dabbling in a lot of areas, and I guess the thing I like to do is to better disseminate and translate knowledge and research about the field of adapted physical education out to our practitioners, out to the school administrators, and even like what you're doing out to the wider public. I think that the word needs to get out that this is in the law, that it's important, and that it's a civil rights issue, and that we need to put more emphasis on it. And I guess that's what I would very much hope that in 35 years, when I'm all said and done, that I can rest my cap on. But I need a lot of people to help me out with that too. So that's not an individual endeavor.
Well, Professor, I have to tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed our time together and our conversation, and I want to commend you for the work that you've already done and wish you all the best of luck in the future. And I want to sincerely thank you for joining me in conversation this morning. It's most appreciated.
I appreciate it, Kevin. It was a fun conversation, and it's always nice to go on somebody else's podcast. So
It's always nice to be on the other side of the camera, isn't it?
it is. It is.
Absolutely, Professor. Have a great. Before I let you go, how can people get in contact with you if they're so inclined to do so?
Sure. My Twitter handle is at Scott McNamara 12. And then they can check out my podcast, What's New in Adapted Physical Education. And if they wanted to send me an email, they can contact me at scott.mcnamara@uni.edu.
Fantastic, Professor. Thank you for letting me virtually travel down to Iowa. And again, I really enjoyed our time together and for you sharing your expertise. It's most appreciated.
I appreciate it. Take care.